Good evening and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. My name is Catherine Shreves, and Doris Baylor and I will be your hosts tonight.
This evening we have with us James C. Burrows II. James is the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer with Children's Hospital of Minnesota. And recently he served as Chief Officer of Diversity and Inclusion for the state of Minnesota. Actually, he's done many things. I've known him as a trial lawyer and also an activist in our community. He recently won the Shining Star Award for his work in civil rights for all people. James, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thank you, Doris, for having me, and thanks, Catherine, for having me as well. I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, so I was a product of the city of Detroit, the Motor City. Went to Morehouse College in Atlanta for undergrad, and Georgetown Law School for schooling, and then came to Minnesota in 1992. My story about coming to Minnesota, people always ask, why did I come to Minnesota? It was for a job opportunity, because I was born and raised in what affectionately known are chocolate cities, mostly brown and black people in Detroit, Atlanta, and DC, but I came here for an opportunity. My background is simple. I'm the son of a proud dad who worked at an auto plant and a mom who worked in insurance or most of her career, but now she's a AME minister as well. And the work I've been doing here in the Twin Cities, you talked about, are social justice, civil rights, diversity and inclusion, and I'm a fully recovered trial lawyer. I used to be recovering from trial practice, but I'm fully recovered and don't miss the trial law at all. But that's my background in a nutshell.
I believe you were the first diversity and inclusion officer for the state of Minnesota. I never heard of that term, and I'd been here 40 years voting every election. Can you explain what your work consisted of working for the state of Minnesota as a chief officer of diversity and inclusion?
Sure, and it's funny because I was actually the first in the nation. When I got hired, Governor Dayton and Jamie Tincher, who was the governor's chief of staff at the time, who's now the deputy mayor in St. Paul, wanted to make sure that diversity of Minnesota was reflected in the state's workforce. So we started off with a diversity in Minnesota. When I first moved here in the 90s, about 6% people of color. By the time I took this position in 2016, it was about 20%. So the governor said, let's create a goal of 20% people of color, Native Americans, for the state, but we need a chief inclusion officer to do that. So they looked around, advertised the position, I applied, and to be quite candid, I didn't want the position at first. I told Jamie and the governor that if this is a position that is about just for pomp and circumstance and not about real change, don't hire me, hire somebody else. I'll be your advocate behind the scenes, but I don't want a position where I can't be authentic with community. They said, no, we want somebody real life to do some real work, and I got hired. When I got hired, I looked around the country and said, okay, I'm going to learn from some other people, get some mentors, set up an advisory committee, and found out I was the first and only chief inclusion officer for the states. Now, since that time, Oregon has a chief inclusion officer, and Virginia just named a new chief inclusion officer as well. My role there was pretty simple. It was to get more people from diverse backgrounds work and employment with the state of Minnesota. We had a workforce of about 9% people of color when I arrived, and when I finished, we ended up having about 13%, so we were on the trend going upward towards that 20% goal. The other part of my work was supplier diversity, making sure we spend more money with Black-owned, Native-owned, Latino-owned, disability-owned, and women-owned businesses and veteran-owned businesses too. That number was abysmal. About in 2015, we spent about $130,000 with Black-owned businesses out of $2 billion. I can't even tell how many zeros come before the percentage on that. But when I left, we had like a 2,000% increase in spending with Black-owned businesses and an increase in others as well. And the third aspect was basically anything that related to community and social justice, the governor had to get involved in that. Perfect example, Philando Castile. When he was shot and killed, I ran the governor's council on law enforcement and community relations and making sure they work with the family, the Castile family, law enforcement to see how can we do better at those kind of situations. So that was it in a nutshell, and I loved the job tremendously.
I know you were very well regarded. I heard your name all over the community. Given the success you had there, what made you make the switch to Children's Minnesota? And now that you're there, what are some of the things you are going to do to eradicate the barriers that children of color experience in our medical system?
That's a deep question. So let me think about that a little bit. So I left because Governor Dayton left. So he appointed me for a 2-year term. I had the opportunity to apply for the new position of the new governor, but I truly thought that God puts me in a place for a reason and a season. And I prayed about it, and he said the season was for working with Governor Dayton and to do the things you did to set up the next person for success. So I didn't want to cloud that with trying to be in the role longer than he wanted me to be there. When I came to Children's, literally I was not looking for Children's Hospital, and the story goes like this. They had a director of diversity position that was a lower level position that they were advertising for. My daughter's doctor, my daughter has sickle cell disease, so she goes to Children's, asked me to apply, and I said, I'll apply, but I don't want a diversity director position. It's not have as much influence as it needs to be successful. They called me up, not to interview, but they said, hey, can you help us create a Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer position? So I spent about 2 hours of my time, redesigned a position for them with no intent of applying. But then when I redesigned it, I said, man, I designed this whole job description. I should at least throw my name in the hat. So I did that, interviewed, and literally it became an aligned with my values. My daughter, who has sickle cell, has been there 7 years. I said, if I can get there and I can create a pathway for children, all children, but especially children of color or those who have been impacted by health disparities, that I think this is the calling for me. So I turned down any other opportunities. I talked to Mark Gorelick, who was the CEO, is the CEO there. He talked about his passion for equity and inclusion. He talked about not only funding this, but also making it a priority for the hospital, and I decided to come. My plan is real simple, to make sure that we can eliminate all health disparities as they relate to people of color, Native Americans. We have some of the most atrocious health disparities in the country here in Minnesota, and we have one of the best run medical systems in Minnesota. So that makes no sense to have that. So it's identifying what are those barriers. Some of them relate to income, but some of them relate to just unconscious bias. Some of them relate to having a workforce and nurses and doctors who are predominantly white and haven't worked with families of color and engaged families of color. You might not know this, but 49% of our patients and families are people of color and Native American, but only about 7% of our physician and nurse workforce is diverse. So we create that more diversity there to serve those patients and families. I think we can do a lot better job. And then also other time is just bringing awareness to it. We have a Health Equity Council that I have the pleasure of leading that has some of our top leaders on it. We also too have a Health Equity Index that addresses some of those disparities related to things like combo vaccine, well-controlled asthma, the Comfort Promise, which means giving pain medication or offering it to people of color and everybody as well. Some of those things we have gross disparities in, so addressing those, measuring them along the way, and making sure that we address the needs for families and community. The one thing I'll add to that is we also too are making sure that we engage community in this process. So it's not telling them what we're going to do to them. The medical profession has done that too long. It's saying what we're going to do with you. And if we're off, you tell us what you need as well.
That's great.
Thank you.
Catherine, you have any questions?
Well, I do. One of the things that I have wondered is what kind of data that you collect so that you can know what success will look like.
That's a good point. So I'll start with the state when I was there.
Yeah.
Before I got there, the governor had already set a 20% goal. He had identified it and said he wanted to have the population in Minnesota be reflected in the workforce in the state. So we were at 9% people of color, Native American. We were at about 5% people with disability. He wanted to reflect those numbers at a higher rate. So we had to look at data to say, okay, where are we now? Looking at data is important because you can't lump all people of color together. You have to do what's called disaggregated data. So we looked at people of color at 9%, then we said, okay, how many of those are African American? How many of those are Latino? How many are Asian? How many are with African American, African, or Native born? Because if we do that, we then have equity strategies related to recruiting and retention for those particular groups. When we did the disaggregation of the data, we found that we could do different things in different groups. So I'll give you an example. Latino Lead is an organization led by quite a few Latino leaders here in the Twin Cities. And when we looked at the Latino data, it was actually one of the lowest as far as people of color at the state. We said, well, how do we expose Latino community to these job opportunities? It wasn't about advertising in a newspaper. It was about identifying people in the community that could connect and through word of mouth, tell us about other folks who could develop a relationship with us. So we held these events called lead-in events where we brought the governor, commissioners, and others to say, you know what, we want to work with you in the community and come to this event that you're already having to kind of meet and greet and have a relationship. So we use the data in order to develop the strategy, disaggregated data around that. Same with supplier diversity at the stake. We were spending a low number with respect to businesses of color, women-owned businesses. So what we said was the data we're spending, I think we're about 3% when I got there. We increased it to like 8% spend by looking at the data and saying where are we spending currently, and then identifying strategies to increase that spend along the way. We did the same thing with people with disabilities. So one of the things I want to make clear on the work that I do is not just about race. Race is some of the largest disparities, but people with disabilities as well is something that we looked at. So at the data we had at the state, we're about 5% people with disabilities when I got there. We hit the goal of 7% that the governor had set. Then we increased the goal to 10% to have more as well. So same with the data that at the state. When I got to Children's, I said, where's the data? What are we doing? And we've been able to look at the data and say that right now we're about 19% people of color at Children's, but that's a misnomer because out of that 19%, that means 80% of our workforce in what's called environmental services, our kitchen jobs, our jobs in janitorial services, which are great jobs. We want diversity there, but about 80% of those folks are people of color, Native American. If you took that out of that 20% number, that number would be a lot lower for leadership roles, doctor and nursing roles, and other things. So we're going to use that data to get better, and once again, disaggregate it by race and ethnicity to see what strategy we need to implement. Same with supplier diversity. Right now, we're probably about a 1% spend at best at Children's. We're going to look at that spend to say, okay, what do we need to do to increase it? So data is important because that's the best way to measure.
Yes.
Governor Dayton used to always tell me, if we don't measure it, it doesn't get done. So we want to make sure that we measure it.
So one of the things that we had talked about earlier that might be helpful for you to talk about again is all the different ways that you are reaching out to people of color for recruiting. So you were mentioning maybe some leadership forums that are coming up or some workforce forums.
So we're doing a lot of different things. So I think the first thing is rebuilding or reestablishing the Children's brand in communities of color. So communities of color come to Children's Hospital, they get great service and they see the great doctors and great nurses, and they're very pleased, people I talk to, but they don't know about the job opportunities. So we want to make sure that when folks come to us for our service, that we're mentioning to them, hey, this is a great place to work, consider working here. So we're doing that through our rebranding and marketing, but we're also doing it through what's called employee resource groups. So we have affinity groups of African American, Latino, we have a Muslim ERG group from those of Muslim faith, we have a pride group for our LGBTQ population as well. We just started an Asian group, but we also started a nurses of color group. So leveraging the folks that we have, telling them that we want them to stay, and then having them be ambassadors in the community as well. So that's one strategy. The other is we are participating in the People of Color Career Fair, which has been an amazing career fair in the Twin Cities here, led by Sharon Smith Akinsanya. When I was at the state, we were a sponsor there, and now Children's is going to be a sponsor as well. It's a day where we get a chance to meet a variety of people from different backgrounds, all people of color who are looking for job opportunities in the workplace. And once again, rebuilding our brand, saying, hey, come work at Children's, this is who we are. And it's not only bringing people in HR there, it's also bringing our top leaders, our CEO, our COO, our chief medical officers, to meet people where they are and say, hey, we want you to come work at Children's. So that's another way. We're going to copy and borrow the lead-in event concept that I created at the state of Minnesota. So we're going to work with ALF, Latino Lead, the Council on Asian American Leaders, and others, and Taway Foundation, to have those groups bring to us or meet with us in the community and say, hey, here's Children's, we want to work with you and partner on the business side of buying more goods and services from your community, but also to being employed. So we'll have more of those kind of networking events as well. And then the last thing is really investing in and sponsoring different events in the community. We're a nonprofit, technically, but we're almost $1 billion nonprofit. So we have the opportunity to spend some of our money to say, hey, you know what? We're going to sponsor an event in the community, have our presence felt at Family Day at the Urban League. Not only just get a table or a tent, we're going to sponsor some events that are important to the community. And when we do that, you build a relationship and trust. Then when I say to you, here's a job opportunity, come apply, you then trust me because I'm invested in your community. So those are just a few things we're doing on the workforce side.
One of the questions that I've had, and Doris and I have been involved in education in Minneapolis, and it always seemed like it was hard to get people of color to come here as teachers because they said you don't have enough of a community here of professional teachers.
Right.
So how do you deal with that at Children's?
Good question. So So I came from the school district in Minneapolis. So I was there for 7 years helping recruit diverse teachers. You can get people to come here, but you have to make it an authentic ask, and you have to make it authentic support. So I'll start with the teachers and move to the children.
Okay.
So the mother of my daughter, Ternisha Burrows, is a teacher of 20 years in the Minnesota School District. She started off in Minneapolis, now she's in the Osseo School District, African-American woman. What happened to her when she got to Minneapolis, I hate to pick on Minneapolis, but it happened a lot back in the day, they'd get under contract, she'd come, she's a great teacher, but then they'd lay off the teachers every year who were the last teachers hired. Well, predominantly those were teachers of color.
Yes.
Those teachers got laid off, they had to go find jobs elsewhere. So Minneapolis would basically fund and train a lot of teachers who are spread throughout Minnesota now because we had the last hired, first let go rule. Now, school districts are getting smart to being creative around how they recruit teachers of color, how you retain them, how you support them. So I think that would help people to come as well. And also you got to be aggressive in recruiting from different places. If you're looking at the same schools all the time that don't have a diverse population, you're going to get the same results.
Right.
Fast forward to healthcare. So if we're looking for doctors and nurses of color, and we're only looking at, nothing wrong with these schools, but if we're only looking at University of Minnesota, St. Kate's, and Minnesota schools who are not racially diverse or as racially diverse, we're going to get the same numbers. But if I say to you, hey, you know what, we're going to go to Morehouse School of Medicine, which is affiliated with Morehouse College, which is a 99.9% African-American male college. It has a diverse med school with women and men of color, and we're going to partner there. And we're going to partner with Meharry Medical School in Nashville, Tennessee, which is predominantly people of color medical school as well. We're going to partner with Xavier University, which is a traditionally black college that has the most black graduates that are medical doctors in the nation, probably in the world. Therefore, we're going to get different results. So we're going to target those schools. And then also, too, we're going to create things like the Diversity Nursing Partnership that our Chief Nursing Officer, Pan Van Hengzige, created on her own. And she just invited me to the table. She said, James, I want to work with St. Kate's to develop a pipeline of more nurses of color. And then that pipeline will be supported by nurses that we have here on staff. So 2 young ladies named Hani and Shelly are nurses of color that are running that diversity partnership. They're creating a nurses of color ERG, and we're supporting their work. So that way we can make sure we have a pipeline that's going to not only get people here, but retain them as well. So I think we can definitely do it. I think teachers of color could be increased more if there were more strategic strategies that address the actually equitable needs of those particular populations, and that's what we're going to try to do at the hospital.
So my memory is that there was a high school in Minneapolis that had a medical.
Edison?
It wasn't Edison.
Roosevelt.
Roosevelt.
Yes.
Were they students who were interested in the medical field?
Yes.
Do you have any connection with them through Children's, or is that something that you've
So we will,
about?
but I'll tell you what we did this summer that I'm excited about. So when I got to Children's in January, we didn't really have a robust equity internship program. What I mean by that is attracting people of color, Native Americans who are younger trying to get in the profession. So I said, hey, how about we do this? We start the program kind of on the fly. We'll build the plane as we fly it. So we partnered with Step Up at Achieve Minneapolis, and we partnered with Right Step in St. Paul to get high school interns from those particular school districts to come over. We got, as last minute, so we got we got 2 from Achieve Minneapolis, and then the Right Step program in St. Paul, we're going to do more next year.
Okay.
We also partner with the Doherty Family College, which is a great program run out of St. Thomas. It's a 2-year program specifically for first-generation college students, mostly of color, and we had 6 interns from there. These young ladies, they all happen to be young ladies, did amazing, amazing work. So much so that one of them just got offered a full-time, part-time position while she's still in school working at our simulation center. So she's going to be working at Children's Hospital while she's still in school at Doherty. And all of the young ladies presented to our leadership team, our top 250 leaders, about 4 weeks ago. They presented some ideas that they came up with through a Shark Tank kind of event that we did, where we said, hey, how can you make Children's better? They came up with ideas about how to have more greetings and welcome in multiple languages, how we could take our IDs and have flags of the original countries that people are from on there, how we could better serve our community. So I'm very passionate about internships. So we had 8 this year, and my goal is to have 30 next year through the high schools that you talked about, but also through the colleges and universities too.
Do you have any questions?
I just want to thank you for coming and to say that Doherty program is an excellent program, and I wish more students knew about it and took advantage of that opportunity to learn.
Yeah, it's an amazing program. One of our board members, Alvin Abrams, is the president of the Doherty College, and he's a board member at Children's. So I tell you all the time, just look where you are and identify the resources you have, and then you can make sure something happens. I think Arthur Ashe said something like that too.
Yes.
But I misquoted it. But yeah, so we had a great opportunity with Doherty, and we're looking to expand that to other more diverse colleges and universities too.
It's great.
So one of the things that we haven't talked about, and it's a little more uncomfortable to talk about, what are the disparities? Let's talk about, I mean, so it's obviously Children's needed you to be addressing this issue because we have, as we know in Minnesota, we have some of the worst disparities in the nation in education, in healthcare, criminal justice system. What are some of the disparities in healthcare?
Sure. So some of the disparities in healthcare are real straightforward. If you are a mother of African descent, you're more likely, 3 times more likely to have infant mortality than a white mother would be. If you are a parent of African American children, they're more likely to not have a well-controlled plan for asthma as opposed to a white individual as well. Some of the other disparities relate to not only proper health care, but who's in the hospital room taking care of your children and families. Now, representation matters, and if we're going to be uncomfortable, let's talk about the fact that, as I said earlier, 49% of our patients are families of color and Native American, but only 7% to 8% are doctors and nurses in there taking care of those families. It doesn't mean that they're going to get different quality of care, but if you have nobody in the room who understands the different cultural norms of different individuals and families, you're going to try to serve them the same way you've served everybody else all your life. And it's a different kind of service needed, it's a different kind of quality of relationship needed as well with healthcare. So that's another disparity in employment that leads to disparate outcomes as well. One of the other ones is too, as it relates to how we communicate with families. A simple thing we're doing this year with our staff is we're translating our employee engagement survey into 3 different languages. So for the first time ever. So we have
And those languages are?
Those languages are Somali, those languages are English, those languages are Spanish, and also Tibetan as well. So we have a large Tibetan population that we serve as our staff members as well. So things like that will help in some of the healthcare disparities because we were able to get a more diverse staff, and then also to talk to them about their engagement while they're there as well. Minnesota has some of the worst disparities in education, employment, healthcare, you name it. But it's not because we don't know what to do about it. We do.
We do.
It's because we don't intentionally invest and say, hey, you know what, we're going to spend the resource to do it. I'm proud of Children's to say they're going to hire a chief inclusion officer, but not only hire the chief inclusion officer, but I'm part of the C-suite with the CEO, with the chief medical officer, with our general counsel, with people that are making the difference on the strategy. I'm not buried beneath 5 layers and not having influence to make the change. So if we do more things like that in the school system, in education, in the private sector, we'll be able to address some of these disparities.
Making it a priority.
Make it a priority, but also to show that by investing in it. You never put your chief financial officer 5 layers down from the CEO.
Never.
You never put your chief marketing officer 5 layers down. So when you put your chief diversity officer there, that's not a priority. And you're not invested in it as well.
That's a very good point. That does say something. Yes.
So one of the things when you were talking about maternal mortality and issues with infant mortality with women of color, I think when Serena Williams had some problems with her pregnancy and delivery. That was a real wake-up call to a lot of us because she is one of the most powerful women. She's the most amazing tennis player. I don't know if you've been watching her in the US Open this week, but she's doing amazing, but I mean physically so strong. And so I think it was a big surprise to all of us. Or just maybe not so much a big surprise as just case in point.
Right. It was a surprise to some of us. It wasn't a surprise to all of us because sometimes we think that if you have economic means and you're of a different racial descent, you're going to be treated differently. Discrimination is discrimination is discrimination. So
Right.
if it's a race-based discrimination, which is happening related to these disparities, you could be Serena, you could be Michelle Obama, you could be Oprah Winfrey. Those things will still happen to you. And I'm glad that people got a visual lens to see that, because now they know it's not about economic status, it's about race. So we need to
Right.
address the racial disparities and how we need to treat the racial disparities differently. So I think it surprised some people. It didn't surprise me, and it didn't surprise some other folks that I know. Same with criminal justice system. If you
Right.
look at, violence as it relates to police and African American males, it doesn't matter what economic status you are. It doesn't matter what happens to you or where you grew up. Those things continue to happen because of race. So I think in Minnesota, I think you mentioned earlier about getting uncomfortable. More of us need to get uncomfortable
Right.
to discuss race, but then
Right.
develop strategies to implement that address those racial disparities.
Right.
Very true.
Right. Well, wow. So you said you were the first equity and inclusion officer for the state of Minnesota and in the country.
The
Are you
nation.
also one of the first in the healthcare industry?
So I'm one of the first. I'm the first in Minnesota. So
Okay.
yes, so the first in Minnesota, Chief Equity Inclusion Officer. Once again, other hospital systems, I'll be fair to them, they do have director of diversity positions, but I'll also be honest with you, those positions aren't at the level that my position is,
Okay.
level of influence. Other states, other hospital systems do have chief diversity officers, so I'm proud to say that. I'm not sure where they're positioned and the influence they have, but I'm saying we're one of the few pediatric systems, because we're the 7th largest pediatric system in the country. I think we're one of the few that has a chief inclusion and equity officer.
Okay. Well, I'm really impressed.
Glad it's him.
Both of us are very impressed. We're all impressed to have you here. We're glad that you are sharing with everybody who will be watching this sort of the steep climb that we have in Minnesota, and that we've got good people working on it. So thank you for that. I want to thank, our guest tonight is James Burrows II, who is the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer with Children's Hospital of Minnesota. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters and hosted by Doris Baylor and myself. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you tune in again. Good night.
Good night.